The New Testament records the virgin birth, miracles, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But many are skeptical of the New Testament's claims concerning Christ. So how can we know if the claims of the New Testament are true? Joining us today as we journey on our quest for the truth to this question are New Testament scholars, Dr. Borland, Dr. King, and Dr. Percer. To begin our discussion, we must first explore the origin of the New Testament. So, professors, when was the New Testament written?
Jesus' disciples first proclaimed Christ's death, burial, and resurrection right after his resurrection and ascension back to heaven. This oral message took on a written form, proclaiming the good news of Christ our Redeemer. This essential message appears in the four Gospels. The three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were penned before AD 70. Matthew, one of the 12 disciples, recorded his first-hand account. Mark recorded the Apostle Peter's recollections, and Luke, a missionary companion of the Apostle Paul, consulted many eyewitnesses. John, also an eyewitness of Christ, penned his gospel toward the end of the first century.
Many New Testament epistles were written before these gospel accounts. James, the brother of Jesus, penned his book around AD 45, just over a decade after Christ's death. Paul wrote his epistle to the Galatians between AD 47 to 48. These early epistles all clearly refer to Jesus as Lord, a reference to his deity.
So we see that the New Testament books were written by the apostles during a period in history where the eyewitnesses were still alive. Therefore, they were personally able to validate the writings of the New Testament and prevented any myth from developing in the accounts. Another key element in preventing the spread of myth is having the facts recorded as soon as possible. So what are the earliest manuscripts of the New Testament, and how many do we have?
Early papyrus copies rapidly circulated throughout the Roman Empire. Scholars have discovered about 120 of these early manuscripts. Some even have large portions of the New Testament, while others contain a single book or page. They date from about AD 100 to AD 700.
For example, the Apostle John wrote the fourth Gospel at the end of the first century. A small papyrus fragment with a portion of the Gospel of John copied onto it was found in Egypt dating to the early 2nd century. This shows how quickly these Gospels traveled. In 30 years, people had copied and transported this Gospel far from its origin in Ephesus. Hundreds of copies were made, and it would have been impossible for anyone to collect and change them all. This is why we can be assured that we have what was originally written by the apostles themselves.
You may be gathering that the New Testament text we have reliably portrays the original text by the numerous copies. But how reliable is the recorded information of the New Testament authors?
Many of the men who wrote the New Testament actually witnessed the events they recorded. The Apostle Peter said, "We were eyewitnesses of His majesty." The Apostle John plainly says, "We have seen with our eyes, have looked upon, and our hands have handled," referring to Jesus. John also says, "And the Word Jesus Christ became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld His glory."
Some skeptics claim that none of the New Testament gospel writers ever met Jesus. The Gospel of John bears all the marks of a true eyewitness account. It was clearly written by a Palestinian Jew of the 1st century who was familiar with Jewish customs, religion, and geography.
One critic, Sir William Ramsay, knighted for his contributions to archaeology, investigated Luke's Gospel in the book of Acts. Ramsay was surprised to find the books to be historically accurate with great precision and concluded that the works were completely authentic. As a result, he trusted Christ and became a great defender of the faith. The highest historical accuracy of the New Testament is beyond question, even though skeptical critics seek to discredit it.
So, we have learned that the historical reliability of the New Testament is well documented and secure. So our next question in our quest to understanding the New Testament's reliability is to find out why the 27 books of the New Testament were accepted, while others were not.
A book was included in the New Testament if an apostle or a close companion of an apostle wrote it in order to affirm their authenticity. This would also mean that the books were written in the 1st century. The books would not contradict themselves or the Old Testament scriptures, and that they would be widely accepted by the early church.
The first person known to us to establish a complete list of New Testament books was Marcion around AD 140. History remembers Marcion merely because he established a shortened canon list, including the Gospels of Luke and 10 letters of Paul. By AD 180, shortly after Marcion, the Gospel canon was complete. Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyon, said the Gospels were written in this order: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. He defends the fact that just as there are 4 corners of the world, there are 4 Gospels.
The 2nd century Muratorian canon is a list of books regarded as authoritative in the early church at that time. It lists the 4 Gospels, Acts, all 13 of Paul's letters, plus the letters of John, Jude, and Revelation. By the end of the 2nd century, other books such as 1 Peter and 1 John had also gained wide acceptance. The Eastern Church accepted Hebrews, and the West accepted Revelation.
Some people claim that the New Testament canon was not fixed until the time of Constantine in AD 325. They even claim that Constantine exerted a great influence on the books chosen for the New Testament, and even their content. But is this assertion true?
Nowhere is there any indication that Constantine tried to influence the selection or the contents of the books of Scripture. It would have been impossible for him to change the contents of individual books because they had circulated among the churches for over 200 years.
The first person to publish a list of New Testament books exactly as it is today was Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, in his Easter letter in AD 367. Since then, few have questioned the contents of the canon, at least until recent times.
Now that we have examined the canonicity of the New Testament, the next step on our journey is to examine the transmission of the text over the centuries. Some critics claim that all we have today in our manuscripts and translations are the accumulated errors of centuries of copying the text with little or nothing resembling the original manuscripts from the 1st century. So is this the case?
First of all, in the earliest period of copying, there were some still living, like Papias and Polycarp, who personally knew the authors of the New Testament. There also remain some who were eyewitnesses of those recorded events. Those witnesses would have quickly pointed out any errors introduced by later copyists that might affect the accuracy of the original inspired accounts.
The New Testament writings were completed during the 1st century AD. However, their original fragile papyrus documents disappeared within years after they were written, generally due to wear and tear. Yet the text of those original documents has remained in existence, preserved in copies and maintained through many subsequent generations that span the centuries.
The New Testament has been copied thousands of times, which naturally leads to copyist errors arising in some of the manuscripts. Fortunately, if the great number of New Testament manuscripts increases the number of scribal errors, it also increases proportionately the means of correcting the errors. The vast number of manuscripts ensures the spotting of scribal errors and also the ability to confidently preserve the exact wording of the originals by comparing the numerous copies of manuscripts.
In fact, the very nature of the transmission of the New Testament contributes to its extreme stability as an ancient text. Copies were not made at a single location, nor were they deliberately conformed to a single master copy imposed by church authority. So, the independence of the scribes at different locations created multiple lines of text transmission. When these independent lines agree on their text, their testimony is of the highest value. Through this process, the common text accurately preserves the original writings of the apostles.
To all this should be added the vast number of manuscript copies available. Between the 1st century and the 16th, there exist over 24,000 manuscripts when you include Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, and other ancient languages. In the Greek language alone, there are over 5,400 manuscripts. This evidence serves as overwhelming confirmation of the integrity of the New Testament text being preserved. There is no other document in all of antiquity that even comes close to what we have in the Bible. There is no competition.
Even though the Greek text of the New Testament was preserved in such an amazing manner throughout history, one still needs to ask if the Greek writings can be accurately translated into everyday languages of today.
Absolutely. Numerous other works of classical Greek and Latin antiquity are known to the modern reader only in translation, and the general reliability of such translations are hardly questioned. As long as a translator renders accurately and precisely what the Greek New Testament text itself states, there should be little question regarding the accuracy of meaning being conveyed from the original text to our modern translations.
As we conclude our quest, we come to realize that the New Testament is demonstrated to be historically reliable. The New Testament books were written shortly after the events, and the earliest manuscripts date to within decades of the original manuscripts. The personal eyewitness testimony of the writers gives the New Testament content great credibility. The 27 books of the New Testament were accepted early on as divinely inspired, and thus authoritative. Also, the vast number of manuscript evidence shows that the New Testament text has been accurately preserved for us today. Can the New Testament be trusted? Without a doubt, the New Testament can be trusted. Now, only one question remains. Will you trust the New Testament and its message of salvation in Jesus Christ?